It's more like conceptualization of and practice of the proper way of being in the world. And I think that's what you're more interested in anyways. I don't see how you can't be, since you're a living thing and you're overwhelmingly motivated to successfully manifest those actions that a living thing has to manifest in order to continue. And it's complicated. Like, you can boil it down to survival and reproduction. It's a good overarching simplification, but there's nothing simple about survival and reproduction. I mean, all sorts of complex monsters emerge out of that, even simple conceptualization. But it's not unreasonable to assume that one of the things that people generally want to do is to continue living in as pain-free manner as possible. It's something like that, although that's a simplification. So now the reason I'm making that case is because the fact that you have a body and yet the fact that you have a nervous system is another set of limitations on how it is that you're going to interact with the world. Okay, so now we've got the nervous system. We can go to higher resolution. We say, well, you have a brain. And the brain, let's see if I can, so that's the prefrontal, that's the frontal cortex there. And that's the temporal cortex there, and that's the parietal cortex there, and that's the sensory cortex there. And these were, if I remember properly, these were divisions that I think were first, well, they were first thought through in the late 19th and early 20th century. They're slightly specialized. So this cortex back here does a lot of the elaboration of vision, and that one there helps you with your sense of embodiment and your knowledge about where your body actually happens to be localized. And then that one helps for example in some elements of language output. And then the frontal cortex, especially the prefrontal part, which is up here, is concerned with the organization and the organization of motor action. And that's a good way of thinking about it. You've got part of your brain that deals with the sensory world and in the integration of the sensory world, which seems to happen about there, where these places meet. And the prefrontal cortex, it grew out of the motor cortex. The motor cortex helps you plan out voluntary actions. The prefrontal cortex grew out of that in the course of evolution. So you might think, well, there's reflex actions, and they happen when something happens to you, you respond. And then that elaborates up into the motor system, and that enables you to act voluntarily in the world. And then that elaborates up into the prefrontal motor system, which helps you plan how you might act in the world. Right? So it's the prefrontal cortex that's the home of, let's call it complex, sophisticated, voluntary thought, which you could think about as a way of representing the world, but which is more accurately a way of generating avatars of yourself in hypothetical worlds to figure out how they would survive if you did implement them into action. And so I think that's why. So one of the weird things that you discover psychometrically is that there's no correlation between conscientiousness and intelligence. And that's a weird one, you know, because people think about intelligence as planning and forward thinking and all of that, but that's also how they think about conscientiousness, as planful behavior and the consideration of future possibilities. But intelligence and conscientiousness have zero correlation. And so you think, well, why is that? Well, I guess it has to be that way, because you couldn't think abstractly if you were prone to act out what you thought. You just go and act it out. And that, like, I mentioned this to you before, when you dream, you're paralyzed. And you can take that little part of the brain that produces that paralysis out of a cat, or out of a person, but we haven't done it with people, out of a cat. And then when the cat falls asleep and hits REM sleep, it'll run around until it runs into something, and then it'll wake up. Well, so the dream thinking is so tightly allied with action that there's no separation between them. So there's no real abstraction there. If you couldn't abstract, you wouldn't be able to think. And the fact that you can abstract means that you can separate your thinking from your action. So that's why, as far as I can tell, there's very little correlation between conscientiousness and intelligence. It's like it has to be that way, because you have to be able to think about things that you wouldn't do if you're going to think. So, and generally we think of people who act as soon as they think as impulsive. So, okay, well, so there's a huge part of the brain that's devoted to sensory processing, and there's a huge part of the brain that's devoted to planning, and the whole prefrontal part of the brain is devoted to planning. And again, so what that indicates is that in large part, as far as your evolved body is concerned, the reason is that you think is so that you can act better. And of course that makes sense, and you can think about memory from that perspective too, because if you think scientifically, you think that your memory of the world is something like an objective record of events, but it's really not very much like that at all. And besides, who cares? You don't need an accurate representation of all the facts about this room. In fact, all it would do is weigh you down. Who cares what color the walls are, or what color the ceiling is, or what color the paint is? All of that's not worth remembering, partly because it has no relationship whatsoever to what you need to do in order to continue to act. And so what you're doing when you remember, as far as I can tell, is that you're mining your experience for information that you can bring forward into the future. It's purely pragmatic. And so, you know, I treat people who have post-traumatic disorder or symptoms of post-traumatic disorder. And so let's say they got post-traumatic stress disorder because a relationship collapsed on them suddenly, which is quite common. You know, they get betrayed or someone leaves them suddenly, and then they don't know what to do, because, especially if they're conscientious, because then they just tear themselves into pieces trying to figure out what they did wrong to bring about that event. And the reason they're doing that is because they want to retool their perceptions and their actions so that the probability that they'll have the same experience again is minimized. And their mind won't leave them alone till they do it. And no wonder, right? Because if you fall into a big pit and you get really hurt, the first thing you should figure out is how to not fall into big pits anymore. And your mind is set up exactly for that. And so what you do with someone who's having problems like that, so maybe they're waking up at the middle of the night obsessing about what went wrong, is you walk them through it. You do a situational analysis first, because one of the oversimplifications that people make, and this is especially true for conscientious people, is if something bad happened to me, I must have done something to deserve it. Now that's actually a pretty functional idea, because it suggests that there are things about your behavior that you could change that would make the future better. But the problem is that, say if it's the collapse of a relationship and you've been with that person for 8 years or longer, well, you did so many things with them that the idea that you did something wrong pretty much extends to every single thing you ever did with them. And that's, how are you going to fix that? And so that's part of the trauma, actually. The trauma is 80 million snakes all at the same time. It's like, well, forget it. You don't have time to go through all that material. And so partly what you do is with people, and this is what you should do with yourself too, is you do a situational analysis. It's like, don't be assuming necessarily that the thing that happened to you only happened to you because of what you did or didn't do. There's all sorts of factors at play. So one of the things that sometimes I do with clients is if they were in a relationship and I can get some reasonable personality information about both of them, I can point out where they were temperamentally incompatible. You know, like if you're a highly conscientious person and your partner is very, very low in conscientiousness, it's like, well, good luck to you two. How the hell are you ever going to work that out? Because you want everything to be exactly where it's supposed to be, and you're working all the time, and your partner could care less whether things were where they're supposed to be, and they're not going to work. And you can butt heads about that forever. The probability that you're going to shift it, you know, except to some minor degree, is very, very low. And so sometimes you end up with someone with whom you get along very well on one temperamental dimension, and you're an absolute catastrophe on the other 4. And the probability that you're going to be able to mediate a huge temperamental difference is extremely low. You wouldn't expect yourself to mediate a huge intellectual difference, right? You're going to make the other person smarter, or maybe you smarter, depending on who you're with. It's like, no, probably not. A bit, maybe. So you do a situational analysis. And so what you're trying to do is to extract out information from your past and your present that will enable you to conduct yourself properly into the future. And so that's another example of the pragmatic element of of thought. Well then, within the brain itself, apart from the major subdivisions which we just described, there are minor subdivisions, and here's a bunch of them listed: the caudate nucleus, the cerebral cortex, the huge newest part of the brain that's about a square meter. If you unfold it, it's all folded up, and most of the processing occurs right on the surface. That's the idea anyways. The thalamus, that's a place where a lot of the information in the brain appears to be integrated. The cerebellum helps you with balance and the sequencing of complex motor activities. The hippocampus, that's the one we talked about before. One of the things that the hippocampus seems to do is compare your model of the world as it's unfolding with the model that you desire to be occurring, and then keeps track of mismatches. And if it detects a mismatch, then it disinhibits other emotional and motivational centers. And that's the beginning of your response to the unknown. So one of them is the hypothalamus. I'm going to concentrate on it for a bit. It's a little tiny part of the brain that's pretty much at the top of the spinal cord. See, it's really small compared to the rest of the brain. Now, it turns out that imagine this is a cat brain for a minute, and you take off the whole cat brain, except for the hypothalamus, which people do. You take off the whole cortex, for example. And then the cat's still alive if you do it carefully, but it doesn't have much of a brain, and so you might think, well, that cat would just do nothing. But cat's actually pretty functional if it's reduced just to its hypothalamus. And that's because the hypothalamus is an incredibly important part of the brain, and it provides what I would say constitute the major frames, the major psychological frames. And so like a decorticate cat can still eat and drink and regulate its body temperature and engage in defensive aggression. And if it's female, it can still mate. Male can't, because the male mating behavior is more complicated. And as long as you keep it in a bounded environment, it can function reasonably well. It's hyper curious though, which is very weird, because you wouldn't expect a cat with no brain to be curious about anything, but a cat with no brain is curious about everything. And that seems to be because part of the reason that you aren't curious about something anymore is because you've investigated it, and you've built a representation of it that's functional. And that functional representation then stands for the thing itself, and then you can ignore it. And so you learn to ignore things. They're interesting to begin with, and then you learn to ignore them. And so one of the things that I think artists do, if they're great artists, is remind you that there's more to things than you see now that you've learned to ignore them. So you get a kind of a hallucinogenic painting of flowers like Van Gogh might produce, like his famous irises, which I think sold for like $220 million or something outrageous. It's like what Van Gogh is trying to show you is what those flowers looked like before you thought you could see them. Because now you flower and you walk by, you know. You don't see it at all because you're off to get a peanut butter sandwich or something. You don't have time to glory in the wonder of the world, you know. You've got something practical to do. So, all right, so we're going to zoom in on the hypothalamus here. And what you see, of course, when you zoom in on the hypothalamus is that it's not a thing. It's a whole bunch of things, and then it's one of those horrible whole bunches of things that are made out of even more bunches of things, and they're made out of more bunches of things. And what's really interesting about going down the body from an analytic perspective is it doesn't seem to get less complex as you go farther down, you know, like some of the, I should actually show you that. I haven't showed you that little video of DNA fixing itself, eh? Oh, I better show you that. It's so cool. It's ridiculously cool, so you definitely need to see it.
Until I encountered the artworks of David Goodsell, who is a molecular biologist at the Scripps Institute. And his pictures are all, everything's accurate, it's all to scale. And his work illuminated for me what the molecular world inside us is like. So this is a transection through blood. In the top left-hand corner, you've got this yellow-green area. The yellow-green area is the fluids of blood, which is mostly water, but it's also antibodies, sugars, hormones, that kind of thing. And the red region is a slice into a red blood cell, and those red molecules are hemoglobin. They are actually red. That's what gives blood its color. And hemoglobin acts as a molecular sponge to soak up the oxygen in your lungs and then carry it to other parts of the body. I was very much inspired by this image many years ago, and I wondered whether we could use computer graphics to represent the molecular world. What would it look like? And that's how I really began. So let's begin. This is DNA in its classic double helix form, and it's from X-ray crystallography, so it's an accurate model of DNA. If we unwind the double helix and unzip the two strands, you see these things that look like teeth.